March 7th, 2014, 2:23 p.m. Grady's Vintage Guitars, a narrow shop wedged between a laundromat and a taco stand on Valencia Street in San Francisco's Mission District that most people walk past without a second glance. That afternoon, 58-year-old Ray Grady sat on a wooden stool behind the counter polishing the frets of a 1959 Gibson Les Paul Standard with a soft cloth. The bell above the door jingled, and the man who stepped inside was about to give Ray the most humbling lesson of his life. But Ray didn't know that yet. In fact, he was already annoyed. The man who entered was tall, lean, wearing a loose mustard-colored linen shirt unbuttoned at the collar, dark jeans faded at the knees, and old brown boots that had seen better days. On his head sat a wide-brimmed black hat, the kind you'd see on a street musician in the Haight. Around his neck hung a long strand of wooden prayer beads, the kind Buddhist monks carried. His skin was brown, weathered by sun and years. He moved slowly, almost gliding, his eyes half closed, as if he was listening to music that nobody else could hear. Ray glanced up, scanned the man from hat to boots, and made his assessment in 3 seconds flat. Street musician. Probably wants to strum something for 20 minutes, then leave without buying. Ray had seen 100 of them. The Mission District was full of guys like this, aging hippies who wandered into guitar shops the way stray cats wandered into fish markets. They touched everything, bought nothing, and wasted your afternoon. Ray Grady was not a patient man. He'd opened this shop in 1991 after spending 15 years as a guitar tech for touring bands. He knew instruments the way a surgeon knew anatomy. Every scratch, every grain of wood, every resonance. His shop was small, but legendary among serious collectors. Vintage Gibsons, pre-war Martins, original Fender Stratocasters from the 50s. The guitars hanging on his walls weren't instruments, they were investments, some worth more than the cars parked outside. His clientele reflected this. Tech billionaires from Silicon Valley who collected guitars the way others collected wine. Session musicians from Los Angeles who drove 3 hours north for a specific pickup configuration. The occasional rock star's manager calling ahead to arrange a private viewing. Ray had built this reputation over 2 decades, and he guarded it fiercely. A sign behind the counter read, "If you have to ask the price, this probably isn't the shop for you." The stranger in the black hat didn't seem to notice the sign. He drifted toward the left wall, where the acoustics hung, his fingers reaching out to touch the body of a 1937 Martin D28. Ray's jaw tightened. That guitar was worth $85,000. It had survived the Great Depression, World War II, and 77 years of existence, and this man was about to put his fingerprints on it. "Excuse me," Ray called out, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Please don't touch the instruments without asking." The man pulled his hand back slowly, not startled, not offended. He turned toward Ray and smiled. It was a strange smile, warm and distant at the same time, as if the man existed in some place between this world and another. "Sorry, my friend," he said softly. His voice carried a gentle accent, something Latin, the vowels round and unhurried. "I just wanted to feel the wood. You can tell a lot about a guitar by touching it. The wood remembers everything." Ray almost rolled his eyes. Here we go. A philosopher. "The wood remembers the price tag, too," Ray said. "That Martin is $85,000, and the oils from your hands can damage the finish." The stranger nodded, unbothered. "I understand. You take good care of your instruments? That's important." He paused, looking around the shop with those half-closed eyes. "This is a beautiful place. It reminds me of the old shops on the Tijuana Strip. When I was a kid, I used to press my face against the window of a guitar shop there, dreaming about the instruments inside. I couldn't afford any of them. I was playing a broken guitar my father gave me. Ray heard the word Tijuana and filed it away. Mexican, probably an immigrant who'd been in the city for years. The mission was full of them. Good people mostly, but not his customers. His customers drove BMWs, not city buses. That's a nice story, Ray said. Not unkindly, but not warmly either. We do have some more affordable pieces in the back. Used electrics, refurbished acoustics, nothing vintage, but decent quality. $300 to $800 range. Want me to show you? This was Ray's polite way of redirecting the man to the cheap section, away from the museum pieces on the walls, away from the instruments that actually mattered. The stranger tilted his head slightly, the way a bird does when it hears a distant sound. "Maybe later," he said. "Right now, I'd like to look around if that's okay." Ray shrugged. "Suit yourself. Just please look with your eyes, not your hands." The stranger nodded and moved deeper into the shop. Ray watched him from behind the counter, arms crossed. There was something about the way this man moved through the space that was different from the usual browsers. Most people who wandered in looked at guitars the way tourists look at paintings in a museum, with polite, detached interest. This man looked at them the way a father looks at his children after a long absence. His eyes lingered on each instrument, studying the curves, the grain of the wood, the way the light caught the lacquer. He moved from guitar to guitar slowly, deliberately, as if he was having a private conversation with each one. Ray found this irritating. The man was taking up space, breathing the same air as an $85,000 Martin, and he clearly couldn't afford a set of strings. But Ray was a businessman. He wouldn't throw the man out. He'd just wait for him to finish his little spiritual tour and leave. Then something happened that caught Ray's attention. The stranger had stopped in front of the electric guitar wall. His eyes were fixed on something in the top row, a spot where Ray kept his crown jewels. The man raised his hand and pointed. "That one, Swamben," he said. "Can I see that one?" Ray followed the man's finger. He was pointing at a 1968 Gibson Les Paul Custom in black finish. One of the most valuable pieces in the shop, $125,000. Ray almost laughed. "That's a 1968 Les Paul Custom, he said, walking toward the wall, but making no move to take it down. Black Beauty, they call it. Original PAF pickups, no modifications, original case. It's one of maybe 12 in this condition worldwide, $125,000. He said the price the way a doctor delivers a terminal diagnosis. Flat, factual, final. He expected the man to whistle, shake his head, and retreat to the cheap section where he belonged. But the stranger just nodded slowly. "Black Beauty," he repeated, almost whispering. "Yes, I had one just like this, 1968. I bought it in San Francisco, right here in the Mission, from a pawn shop on 16th Street. Paid $200 for it. The action was terrible. The neck was slightly warped, but the tone—" He closed his eyes. The tone was like a woman singing in a cathedral. It filled every corner of the room. Ray stared at the man. Everyone had a story. Last month, some guy claimed his uncle had played with Hendrix at Monterey. The month before, a woman said she dated Jim Morrison. In this business, everyone was 2 degrees of separation from a rock legend. None of it was ever true. $200 for a '68 Les Paul custom, Ray said, his voice carrying a thin smile. That would have been quite the deal. It was 1970, the stranger said simply. Things were different. Guitars were just guitars then. Nobody was calling them investments. Ray glanced at the clock. 2:41 p.m. This man had been in his shop for almost 20 minutes and hadn't spent a single dollar. Meanwhile, Ray had a client coming at 3:30, a tech executive from Palo Alto who was considering a $200,000 collection purchase. Ray needed to prepare the display room, lay out the instruments, make sure the lighting was right. He didn't have time for stories about pawn shop guitars. Listen, Ray said, stepping from behind the counter, I appreciate the nostalgia, but I've got appointments this afternoon. If there's something in your price range, I'm happy to help. Otherwise, you're welcome to browse, but I need to start setting up for a client. The stranger turned from the guitar wall and looked at Ray. For the first time, his eyes were fully open. They were dark brown, almost black, with a depth that made Ray suddenly uncomfortable. It was like looking into a well that had no bottom. Your client, the stranger said, is he a musician? Ray was caught off guard by the question. He's a collector, tech industry, very serious buyer. The stranger smiled that faraway smile again. A collector who doesn't play. Interesting. He buys guitars the way some people buy paintings, to hang on a wall, to show other people. He paused. Does he know what a guitar sounds like at 3 o'clock in the morning when you're alone and the whole world is asleep and the only thing keeping you alive is the vibration of the strings under your fingers? Ray opened his mouth to respond, but found he had nothing to say. The question had landed somewhere deep in a place he'd forgotten existed, because Ray Grady had once known exactly what that felt like. Before the shop, before the business, before the price tags. He'd been a 22-year-old kid sleeping on a mattress on the floor, playing a beat-up Telecaster until sunrise, because the music was all he had. But that was 36 years ago. That kid was gone. That's a lovely thought, Ray said, recovering quickly. But lovely thoughts don't pay the rent on Valencia Street. He paused, then added more gently, Look, there are some good shops on Haight Street, more relaxed atmosphere. You might enjoy browsing there. This was Ray's way of saying, You don't belong here. And both men knew it. The stranger didn't move toward the door. Instead, he did something unexpected. He laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not a defensive laugh, but a genuine soft laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his chest. It was the laugh of a man who had heard far worse things in his life and had made peace with all of them. Haight Street, the stranger repeated, shaking his head gently. I played my first street gig on Haight Street, 1966. I was 19 years old. I had a guitar with a cracked neck held together with electrical tape, and I played for 6 hours straight. You know how much I made that day? $11.35. A woman gave me a sandwich, turkey, and cheese. I remember because I hadn't eaten since the morning before. Ray listened, but didn't engage. He'd heard these kinds of stories before. Every aging musician in San Francisco had a Haight Street origin story. It was practically a requirement for living in the Mission. The stranger continued, moving slowly along the electric guitar wall. After that, I got a job washing dishes at the Tick-Tock Drive-In on 3rd Street. 12 hours a day, my hands in hot water, soap burning the cuts on my fingers. But every night after my shift, I'd walk to a little club and play. No pay, just playing. Because the music, it wasn't something I did. It was something I was. He stopped in front of a glass display case near the back of the shop. Inside the case, mounted on black velvet, was a collection of guitar picks, each one signed by a different artist. Ray was proud of this collection. It had taken him 15 years to assemble. Picks signed by Clapton, Page, Hendrix, B.B. King, and in the center of the display, under its own small spotlight, was a pick signed by Carlos Santana. The stranger stared at the pick for a long time. His expression changed. The dreamy, faraway look was gone. In its place was something raw, something private, like watching a man read a letter from his younger self. His fingers pressed lightly against the glass. "This pick," he said quietly. "Where did you get it?" Ray walked over, pleased that the man had at least noticed the most impressive display in the shop. "That's a Carlos Santana signed pick," he said, puffing up slightly. "Authenticated by PSA. He signed it at a charity event in 2009. It's part of my personal collection, not for sale." The stranger kept staring at the pick. 2009, he murmured. "Which charity event?" Ray thought for a moment. "I believe it was the Milagro Foundation event in San Jose. Santana's own charity. He signed about 50 picks that night for an auction." The stranger nodded very slowly. "The Milagro Foundation," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I remember that night. It was raining. The venue had a leak in the ceiling right above the stage. Water kept dripping onto the monitors. The sound engineer was losing his mind." He paused. "But the music was beautiful that night. Sometimes the imperfections make it beautiful." Ray felt a flicker of something. Not recognition, not yet. More like the feeling you get when you're driving in fog and you see the faintest outline of headlights approaching. Something was there, but he couldn't see it clearly. "You were at that event?" Ray asked, his tone shifting slightly from dismissal to curiosity. "I was," the stranger said simply. "As a guest?" The stranger smiled but didn't answer. He moved away from the display case and walked toward the center of the shop, where Ray kept his most prized electric guitars. His eyes settled on something hanging on the wall in a custom glass frame. It was a PRS Santana model, the signature guitar that Paul Reed Smith had designed specifically for Carlos Santana. Mahogany body, carved maple top. The distinctive Santana headstock. This particular one was a limited edition from 1995, number 7 of 100. Ray had acquired it at an estate sale 2 years ago for $45,000. He'd priced it at $78,000. The stranger stood in front of the guitar and went completely still. If Ray had been paying closer attention, he would have noticed that the man's breathing had changed. It was deeper now, slower, the way a person breathes when they're trying not to cry. "This guitar," the stranger said, and his voice cracked on the word guitar. He cleared his throat. "This is a PRS Santana model, 1995, number 7 of 100. Ray raised his eyebrows. "You know your guitars?" "Yes, that's exactly what it is." Paul Reed Smith made those specifically for Santana. The man himself played number 1. This is number 7. Previous owner was a collector in Portland who passed away. The stranger was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, and his words came out slowly, carefully, like a man walking across thin ice. "The collector, in Portland. His name was David, wasn't it?" "David Hernandez." Ray froze. Nobody knew that name. Ray had acquired the guitar through a private estate sale. The transaction had been handled by a lawyer. No public records, no auction house listings, no online trail. David Hernandez had been a reclusive man who kept his collection hidden from the world. Even most dealers in the vintage guitar community didn't know his name. So, how did this stranger, this man in a faded shirt and old boots, know it? "How do you know who that name?" Ray asked, his voice dropping to something between suspicion and unease. The stranger's eyes were still fixed on the guitar. "David was a good man," he said softly. "A quiet man. He worked as a high school music teacher in Portland for 31 years. He never made much money, but he loved guitars more than anyone I've ever known. He came to one of my shows in Portland in 1996, waited outside the venue in the rain for 2 hours just to say hello. When I came out, he was shivering, holding a notebook, too nervous to speak. I signed his notebook, and we talked for 40 minutes, standing there in the rain. He told me he'd saved for 3 years to buy that PRS number 7. He said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever owned." Ray's mouth had gone dry. He reached for the water bottle under the counter and took a slow sip, buying himself time to think. This man knew details that were impossible to know unless he was telling the truth. But the truth meant something that Ray's mind wasn't ready to accept. "One of your shows?" Ray repeated carefully. "What do you mean, one of your shows?" The stranger finally turned away from the guitar and looked directly at Ray, those dark eyes, deep and still as a lake at midnight. "I mean exactly what I said, my friend." Ray's brain was working now, processing information it had been ignoring for 20 minutes. The black hat, the prayer beads, the Latin accent, the way he talked about guitars as if they were living things, the Tijuana childhood, the Haight Street busking story, the TikTok drive-in, the knowledge about the Milagro Foundation event, details that only someone who was there, not as a guest but on that stage, could possibly know. The PRS Santana guitar bringing tears to his eyes, knowing David Hernandez by name. Each detail alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a picture that was now screaming at Ray so loudly he couldn't believe he hadn't seen it before. But still, his mind resisted, because the man standing in front of him didn't look like a rock legend. He looked like someone who took the bus. He looked like the men Ray saw every morning at the taqueria on the corner, eating huevos rancheros and reading La Opinión. He looked ordinary, and Ray Grady had spent his entire career believing that extraordinary people looked extraordinary. Just then, the door chimed. A young woman walked in, mid-20s, carrying a guitar case. She was one of Ray's regular customers, a session guitarist named Elena Voss, who played for a popular indie band. She came in every few weeks to browse, occasionally buying strings or a vintage pedal. "Hey, Ray!" she called out, setting her case by the door. Then she saw the stranger and stopped dead in her tracks. Her face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds: confusion, recognition, disbelief. "Oh my God," she whispered. Her hands flew to her mouth. Her eyes were filling with tears. "Oh my God, you're Carlos Santana!" The words hit the room like a thunderclap in a library. Everything went silent. The hum of the air conditioner, the distant traffic on Valencia Street, the barely audible classic rock playing from the shop speakers, all of it seemed to vanish, replaced by a ringing silence that pressed against the walls. Ray Grady didn't move. He stood behind the counter, his hands flat on the glass surface, and felt the ground shift beneath him. Not physically, but in every other way that mattered. The last 20 minutes replayed in his mind at triple speed. The mustard shirt, the prayer beads, The black hat. That signature black hat that Carlos Santana had worn for decades. The accent. Not just any Latin accent, but specifically Mexican. Specifically from someone who'd grown up between Jalisco and Tijuana. The way the man moved through the shop, touching instruments with a reverence that only came from a lifetime of playing. The story about the Tick-Tock Drive-In, the same restaurant mentioned in Santana's autobiography. The Milagro Foundation, Santana's own charity that he'd founded in 1998 to help underprivileged children. And the PRS guitar, of course. Paul Reed Smith had designed that guitar for one man and one man only. And that man was standing 3 feet away from Ray in a faded linen shirt, being told to go browse on Haight Street. The stranger, Carlos Santana, 10-time Grammy winner, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee, the man whose guitar had screamed at Woodstock when he was just 22 years old, looked at Elena and smiled warmly. "Hello, mija," he said. Elena was trembling, actual trembling, her hands shaking at her sides, her lips quivering. She took a step forward, then stopped as if approaching a sacred object. "Mr. Santana, I grew up listening to you. My father played Abraxas every Sunday morning, every single Sunday. It was like church in our house. When I heard Europa for the first time, I was 11 years old, and I told my father, I want to make sounds like that. He bought me my first guitar the next day, a used Yamaha from a garage sale, $25. I still have it." Carlos Santana listened to every word. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't give her the polite, distant smile that famous people give to fans when they want to move on. He listened the way a priest listens to a confession with his entire being. "Your father," Carlos said. "What's his name?" "Miguel. Miguel Voss. He's a carpenter in Oakland." Carlos nodded slowly. "A carpenter who raised a guitarist. That's beautiful, mija. You know, my father was a mariachi musician in Outland de Navarro, a small town in Jalisco. He taught me violin when I was 5. I hated it." He laughed softly. "I wanted to play guitar. He said the violin was more dignified. We fought about it for years, but everything I know about melody, about making an instrument sing, I learned from him, even though I was too stubborn to admit it when he was alive." Elena wiped her eyes. "He passed away?" 1997, heart attack. I was on tour in Europe. By the time I got to Mexico, he was already in the ground. I never said goodbye." Carlos paused, and his voice dropped to something barely audible. "That's the thing about music, mija. It teaches you everything about emotion, about expressing what's inside you, but it doesn't teach you how to say the simple things to the people who matter. I could play a guitar solo that would make 10,000 strangers cry, but I couldn't tell my own father that I loved him." The shop was completely silent. Elena stood with tears streaming down her face. Even Ray, still frozen behind the counter, felt something crack inside his chest, something he'd been keeping sealed for a very long time. Ray Grady's father had been a jazz musician, trumpet player, played small clubs in Chicago in the 60s, never made it big, never recorded an album, never got his name on a marquee. He died in 1998 in a nursing home in Evanston, Illinois. Ray hadn't visited him in the last 6 months of his life. He'd been too busy building the shop, chasing inventory, making deals. The last time they spoke on the phone, his father had said, "Raymond, do you still play?" And Ray had said, "Dad, I don't have time for that anymore." His father had gone quiet for a long moment, then said, "That's a shame. You had a beautiful touch." Ray hadn't thought about that conversation in 16 years. Now, Standing in his shop, listening to Carlos Santana talk about his own father, every word landed like a hammer on glass. Carlos turned to Ray. The rock legend looked at the shop owner, and there was no anger in his eyes, no resentment for the way he'd been treated. There was only understanding. "I want to buy that PRS," Carlos said. "Number 7. David would have wanted it to come to me, and I want the Black Beauty, the 68 Les Paul, and that Martin D28 you told me not to touch." He smiled. "I promise I'll be gentle with her." Ray couldn't speak. His throat had closed. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked like a man drowning in 3 feet of water. "Mr. Santana," he finally managed, "I don't know what to say. The way I treated you, the things I said suggesting Hate Street, implying you couldn't afford." His voice broke. "In 40 years, I've never been so wrong about a person. I'm ashamed." Carlos walked to the counter and placed both hands flat on the glass, mirroring Ray's posture. Their faces were 2 feet apart. Up close, Ray could see the lines on Carlos's face, each one a roadmap of a life lived fully. The small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall in Tijuana, the laugh lines around his mouth, deep as river valleys, the prayer beads resting against his chest, each wooden bead worn smooth by years of touch. "Ray," Carlos said, his voice gentle, "don't be ashamed. Be awake. There's a difference. Shame makes you hide. Waking up makes you see." He tapped the glass counter lightly with his finger. "You looked at me and saw a man who couldn't afford your guitars. But you know what I saw when I walked in? I saw a man who used to love music and somewhere along the way forgot why." Ray felt those words enter his body like a slow injection, not painful exactly, but impossible to ignore, because Carlos Santana had just described him with surgical precision. Ray had opened this shop because he loved guitars. He loved the way they smelled, the way the wood aged, the way a perfectly set-up instrument felt in your hands like an extension of your soul. But somewhere between the first sale and the millionth price tag, the love had been replaced by arithmetic. He'd stopped hearing music and started hearing money. Every guitar that came through his door wasn't a voice anymore. It was a number. And the worst part was, he hadn't even noticed the change. It had happened so slowly, so gradually, like hair turning gray or a river changing course. One day you wake up and you're a 58-year-old man who tells a living legend to go browse on Hate Street because his boots are old. Elena broke the silence. "Mr. Santana, can I ask you something?" Carlos turned to her. "Of course, mija. That song, Europa, when you play it, where do you go? Because when I listen to it, I feel like you're somewhere else. Like your body is on stage, but your spirit is somewhere far away." Carlos was quiet for a moment. He reached up and touched the prayer beads around his neck, rolling one bead between his thumb and forefinger. It was a gesture he'd made 10,000 times before, a small ritual of centering himself before saying something important. Carlos was quiet for a moment. He reached up and touched the prayer beads around his neck, rolling one bead between his thumb and forefinger. It was a gesture he'd made 10,000 times before, a small ritual of centering himself before saying something important. "When I play Europa," he said slowly, "I go back to Tijuana. I'm 8 years old. My father is sitting on a wooden chair in our kitchen playing violin. My mother is cooking beans on the stove. The whole house smells like cumin and onions. My little sister is sleeping on the floor on a blanket, and my father is playing this melody. this simple, beautiful melody that I've never been able to find again. I don't know what song it was, maybe he made it up, but that melody is inside every note I've ever played. When you hear Europa, you're hearing an 8-year-old boy in Tijuana trying to remember his father's song. Elena put her hand over her heart. Ray turned away slightly, pretending to adjust something on the shelf behind him. He didn't want anyone to see his face because his eyes were wet, and Ray Grady did not cry. Not when his father died, not when his marriage ended, not when his first shop burned down in 1989. He didn't cry. That was his rule. But Carlos Santana had just broken a rule that had held for 30 years, and he'd done it with nothing but a story about beans and a violin. Carlos reached into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out a guitar pick. It was old, worn smooth on the edges, the printing almost completely faded. He held it up between two fingers. "You see this? He said. "This is the first pick I ever owned. A man named Javier Batiz gave it to me in Tijuana in 1959. I was 12 years old. Javier was the greatest guitarist in Tijuana. He played rock and roll and blues when nobody in Mexico knew what those words meant. He gave me this pick and said, 'Carlos, the guitar doesn't care if you're rich or poor, Mexican or American, famous or nobody. It only cares if you're honest.' I've carried this pick in my pocket for 55 years. Every show, every recording session, every rehearsal. It reminds me who I am when the world tries to tell me I'm something else." He placed the pick on the counter next to the display case, where Ray kept his authenticated PSA, certified Carlos Santana pick worth thousands of dollars. The contrast was devastating. One pick behind glass, professionally mounted, assigned a monetary value treated as an artifact. The other pick on the counter held together by memory and love, carried in a pocket next to loose change worth nothing to anyone except the man who owned it. And yet it was obvious, painfully obvious, which pick held the real value. "I want to give you this," Carlos said to Ray. Ray stared at the pick. "I can't accept that. That's Mr. Santana. That's a piece of history." "Everything is a piece of history, my friend. The question is whether it stays locked behind glass or whether it lives in someone's hands." He pushed the pick closer to Ray. "Take it. Put it in your pocket. Not in a display case. In your pocket, where it can remind you every day why you fell in love with guitars in the first place." Ray reached out and picked up the worn piece of plastic. It weighed almost nothing, but it felt heavy in a way he couldn't explain. Heavy the way a photograph of your dead father feels heavy. Heavy the way the last letter from someone you loved feels heavy. "Thank you," Ray whispered. It was all he could manage. Carlos smiled and turned back to the shop. He wasn't finished. He walked through the aisles slowly, selecting pieces with the careful eye of a man who had spent 60 years understanding what made a guitar more than just wood and wire. He picked a 1964 Fender Stratocaster in sunburst finish, a vintage Ibanez tube screamer pedal from 1979, and a set of original Ernie Ball strings still sealed in their 1970s packaging. He brought each item to the counter the way a man brings flowers to a grave, gently, reverently, knowing the weight of what he carried. The total came to $288,000. Ray's hand shook as he processed the credit card. He'd had large sales before, 6-figure transactions with Silicon Valley executives who barely glanced at the instruments before signing. But this was different. This man wasn't buying investments. He was buying memories. He was buying pieces of a story that only he could read. While Ray wrapped each piece in protective cloth, Carlos leaned against the counter and looked at Elena. "You said your father is a carpenter in Oakland." Elena nodded. "Yes, he builds cabinets, custom work. Does he still listen to Abraxas on Sundays?" Elena's face softened. "Every Sunday, without fail, even when my mother complains that she's heard it 1,000 times. Carlos laughed. "Your mother sounds like my first wife, Deborah. She once told me, 'Carlos, if I hear Black Magic Woman one more time, I'm going to lose my mind.' I told her, 'Deborah, that song paid for this house.' She didn't find it funny." He paused, his eyes twinkling. "She was right, though. I played that song too much. Even I got tired of it sometimes. But you know what? Every time I play it live,